Leon West had never been one for the spotlight. The lab where he worked, more of a cluttered garage with some outdated equipment than a proper research facility, was not the place where you'd expect to find the next big breakthrough in astrophysics. But that was exactly what Leon was hoping for. Or at least, hoping for the chance to make his name before he turned 40 and became just another forgotten academic footnote. At 33, he was still trying to prove that he wasn't just the son of some obscure physics professor who died of an existential crisis when he realized that theoretical physics didn't actually pay bills. Leon's colleagues at the Institute for Advanced Astrophysical Studies didn't think much of his work. They called it far-fetched and impractical, and Leon couldn't quite figure out how to argue that the concept of tiny, portable black holes could revolutionize the energy industry. No one was interested in his theories about harnessing gravitational fields and bending spacetime to extract unlimited energy from the universe. No one except Leon, who was so obsessed with his work that he spent hours tweaking equations on napkins in coffee shops, only to have people tell him to get a real job that afternoon. However, Leon had a plan. A bold one. A potentially world-changing one. If he didn't screw it up, the small, cluttered lab smelled of burnt coffee and something more metallic. Various wires and cables snaked across the floor, leading to the central piece of equipment, a glowing particle accelerator he'd cobbled together himself from discarded parts and government surplus. He'd taken the risk to apply for a modest grant from a private research firm, one that believed in his vision of harnessing micro-black holes to solve the world's energy crisis. The funding had come through after a number of creative proposals and a lot of heavy persuasion. The plan was simple: create a particle collider that would generate a micro-black hole. If he could create a stable, tiny black hole, he could use it to manipulate gravity and maybe, just maybe, start the process of solving Earth's looming ecological disasters. Not that the lab looked like anyone would believe in him. The walls were covered with scribbled equations, some of which made sense, others that were just random doodles of spiraling galaxies. Leon adjusted the knobs on the particle accelerator, wiping a smudge of coffee from his glasses. He took a deep breath, cleared his throat, and muttered to himself as if trying to reassure his own nerves. "All right, let's make history, or, a really great disaster." He hit the switch. The accelerator hummed to life, sending waves of energy through the cables and into the small chamber where the experiment was taking place. The lights above flickered, and for a moment, the sound of the hum filled the space like the heartbeat of a giant machine. Leon stepped back from the panel, eyes wide. His hands trembled slightly, not with fear, but with anticipation. The display on the screen in front of him showed that the quantum field was in flux, an indication that something was working. Then the numbers spiked. Something was happening. That's not supposed to. Before he could finish his sentence, the room was filled with an intense pull, like the sudden pressure of gravity had shifted, as if something enormous was coming from within his own body. The lights above buzzed in an electrical frenzy as the small black hole he had created began to destabilize. It wasn't supposed to happen this quickly. His calculations had been clear: the particle's movement should have been slow, methodical. But this was anything but. Leon gasped, trying to stabilize the machine. But the black hole was already reacting to the spacetime alterations. The energy began to spiral inward, sucking everything toward it. Papers fluttered into the air like leaves caught in a windstorm, and tools rattled across the counter, drawn to the singularity with terrifying speed. In that instant, Leon made a fatal mistake. He inhaled. A tiny cloud of particles, invisible to the naked eye, swirled into his body. Leon froze. The room seemed to tilt around him as his vision blurred. His hand shook as he pressed against the console, trying to shut the machine off, but it was already too late. He wasn't sure how much time passed, but when the world finally stopped spinning, the black hole had vanished. The lab was in ruins, nothing more than debris and overturned equipment. He stood there, eyes wide, breath shallow. But something felt different. His body felt different, that it was like he was floating. Or maybe the ground had suddenly become heavier. Leon wasn't sure. His body was still, too still. For a moment, panic began to bubble in his chest. Did I just? His voice trembled, and as he said the words aloud, they sounded too real. Too surreal. Leon reached down to steady himself on the workbench, only to watch as the tools, an old wrench, a screwdriver, seemingly lifted off the surface. He blinked. His heart thudded in his chest. The wrench shot straight into his hand as if obeying his unspoken command. What the hell? Leon whispered to himself, still unsure if he was hallucinating. But no, this wasn't a dream. The gravity in the room had shifted. And it was him. He could feel it. Suddenly, the door to the lab opened, and Sarah Bennett, the only colleague who had ever supported him, stepped inside. She froze, eyes wide, her mouth hanging open. "Leon?" she asked, barely above a whisper. What did you do?" He looked at her, dumbfounded, still holding the floating wrench. He didn't have an answer. The next day, Leon's apartment looked like the aftermath of an existential breakdown. Half-empty pizza boxes and spilled coffee scattered around the place. His small kitchen was in chaos, the microwave was mysteriously stuck halfway open, and his bookshelves had been completely rearranged without him even touching them. Leon had always been a little messy, but this was something different. He felt as if the world around him was bending, moving, reshaping itself in subtle, impossible ways. "Okay," he muttered aloud, standing in the middle of his apartment, "this is either a science fiction movie or I'm about to be eaten alive by gravity itself." He inhaled deeply, trying to focus. The strange pull he had felt in the lab was still there. His mind seemed to be trying to process everything at once. He reached for his coffee mug, but it didn't fall back into his hand like it was supposed to. Instead, it hovered there, suspended in midair. Leon blinked, his heart pounding. He reached out with his hand, his fingers brushing against the mug. It slowly drifted toward him, as though the very air was cooperating. Okay, that's unsettling. He took a sip, his mind racing. But something else happened. The cup clinked on the counter, then, without any warning, his microwave suddenly zipped across the kitchen, crashing into the wall. He stood frozen, unsure whether to be scared or amazed. Gravity was now his plaything. But what exactly did that mean? Was he still Leon? Or was he becoming something else entirely? His mind was spinning in circles. He felt the need to test the boundaries of his new abilities, but he also knew the dangers. The ground under his feet felt like it was moving, and the walls seemed to be pressing in on him. It wasn't just objects that were reacting to his presence, he could feel the space itself warping. And then there was the voice. He wasn't sure where it came from, his mind, perhaps, or somewhere deeper. "It's not enough to just control objects, Leon. You have to control time, too." The thought chilled him. Leon stood there in the middle of his kitchen, staring at the floating coffee cup, his mind racing. The air was dense with a strange energy, as though the very space around him was bending, responding to him, molding itself in ways he couldn't yet understand. He knew, without a doubt, that something inside him had changed the moment that particle of black hole matter entered his body. He could feel it. The universe wasn't just a thing he studied, it was something he could now control. That voice, though, the one that seemed to echo in his mind, was not something he could ignore. Control time? Leon didn't want to consider what that could mean. He didn't even know how to control the gravity pulling everything toward him. Time? He wasn't ready for that. He wasn't sure he even wanted that kind of power. "All right," he muttered to himself, trying to steady his nerves. "I just need to figure this out." He was trying to convince himself that it was a fluke, that maybe, somehow, he was imagining it. But he wasn't. He felt it in his bones. The black hole was inside him. Not just as some foreign substance, but as a new engine, a living force that changed the very fabric of his being. He was the experiment now. The feeling was unnerving. He had to test it. He had to understand it. Tentatively, he reached for a chair nearby, not really sure what he expected to happen. When his fingers brushed it, the chair didn't simply tip or slide away. It floated, hovering inches above the floor, then rotated slowly, as though waiting for him to command it. "Okay, no need to freak out." His voice shook as he muttered to himself, but he had to admit that the power he felt was exhilarating. He clenched his fist, and the chair shot across the room, slamming into the far wall. It splintered into pieces, shards of wood scattering like confetti. Leon froze, eyes wide. He hadn't meant to do that. He hadn't even been thinking. What was happening to him? He breathed in deeply, trying to calm himself. "You're in control, Leon. It's just gravity. It's just you. It's fine." But the universe wasn't having any of it. The next morning, Leon didn't go into the lab. He couldn't, not after what happened last night. He spent the entire morning pacing around his apartment, testing his abilities, trying to understand the limits of what he could do. He tried making a pencil float, then an entire bookshelf, then a fridge. Each time, his powers responded to his thoughts as though they were part of him. He controlled the gravity in ways that were too perfect, too effortless. But with every test, the air grew heavier, more dense, as if the black hole inside him was expanding, reaching out to consume everything in its path. Eventually, his curiosity got the better of him. He had to go back to the lab, had to see if his equations were still intact. It was the only way he'd be able to figure out what had happened to him. The lab was in even worse shape than it had been the night before. The walls were scorched where sparks from the experiment had hit, and the floor was littered with broken glass and overturned equipment. Leon stepped carefully around the debris, avoiding the jagged remnants of the particle accelerator, his mind focused on finding the data he'd recorded during the experiment. But his gaze kept drifting toward the corner, where the machine had originally malfunctioned. It was clear something had shifted within him, something fundamental. The black hole particle hadn't just been absorbed, it had merged with him, reprogramming his body at the atomic level. The more he thought about it, the more terrifying it became. The very laws of physics seemed to be unraveling in his presence, and that was just the beginning. As he sifted through the notes, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Sarah. "Leon, we need to talk." It was short, but the urgency in her words was clear. He texted back, "Meet me at the lab in 30 minutes. Then he sat back, letting the weight of what had happened sink in. Sarah had always been his friend, his colleague. But would she still see him as the same man? What if he wasn't? Leon's thoughts turned to the state of the world. While he was wrapped up in the insanity of his own body's transformation, the planet itself was teetering on the edge of collapse. He'd been following the news about climate change, rising sea levels, and the increasing frequency of natural disasters. Everything was spiraling out of control. His experiment might have been an accident, but could it be the solution? If he could manipulate the planet's gravitational field, restore the balance of the Earth, maybe he could fix it. He could reverse the damage humanity had done. Or, he thought with a chill running down his spine, maybe he could destroy it. What if the black hole inside him couldn't be controlled? What if it pulled everything into itself, starting with the planet? The door opened. Sarah stepped inside, her eyes scanning the wreckage, then landing on Leon. She looked both worried and fascinated. "Leon, she began, but he raised a hand, cutting her off. "Before you say anything," he said, his voice low, "I need you to understand something. This is not a joke. This isn't a trick. The experiment, it worked. Too well." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Leon closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. He could feel the pull of the black hole inside him, thrumming beneath his skin like a heartbeat. He wasn't sure how to explain it, but he had to try. I inhaled it, Sarah. The particle. The black hole. It's inside me now. And I can control gravity. He paused, letting the words sink in. I can feel the space around me warp. I can bend it. But I don't know how long I can hold it back. For a moment, Sarah didn't say anything. She just stared at him, her face unreadable. Then, she stepped forward, inspecting him as though he were a piece of alien technology she was trying to figure out. Finally, she spoke. I knew it was risky, she said slowly. But this is beyond anything I could have imagined. Leon felt his stomach churn. What if I can't control it? What if, don't worry, she interrupted, her voice calming. We'll figure this out together. But you need to be careful. The moment you start messing with gravity on a global scale, you're not just playing with your own life. You're playing with everyone's. Her words hit him hard. He knew what she was saying. The gravity well inside him was growing. He could feel it pulling on everything around him, distorting the air, warping the space. If he didn't get control over it, it could consume more than just a few chairs and coffee mugs. It could take the world. All right, he said, the determination in his voice growing. Then let's figure it out. The Earth needs help. And I think I can fix it. I just need to understand how this thing works before it eats me alive. The next few days were a blur of scientific research, trial and error, and sleepless nights. Sarah helped him construct a rudimentary device to monitor his fluctuations in gravitational force, and together, they tried to map out the effects of the black hole inside him. They began by testing Leon's limits. How far could he push the manipulation of gravity without losing control? How much could he alter the Earth's gravitational field before things started to unravel? As the days passed, Leon's understanding of his own abilities deepened. He could compress space, twist time, though he dared not experiment with that yet. He could create localized gravity wells, reverse the direction of gravity in small areas, and even phase objects through solid matter. He was growing more powerful by the day, but so too was the pressure inside him. The black hole engine in his chest wasn't just a passive force, it was alive, hungry, and it craved more. It was on the fourth night, after Leon had nearly destroyed his own apartment again with a reckless display of power, that he realized just how dangerous it all was. He wasn't just experimenting with gravity anymore. He was playing with time and space itself, and that, he feared, would soon have consequences. The pressure inside Leon's chest was getting worse. It wasn't just the heavy feeling that seemed to press on his ribs, like a ton of bricks, it was something deeper. The black hole inside him, the engine that had begun as a tiny speck of cosmic matter, was growing, expanding. Every test, every manipulation, made it bigger, stronger. It was as though his body was a battery, and the more energy he generated, the more it demanded. The first few days of testing had been controlled. At least, as controlled as things could be when you were experimenting with the very fabric of space-time. But every time Leon tried to push the limits of his powers, something else inside him stirred. He could feel the black hole pulling harder at the edges of his consciousness, a constant low hum in his mind like the rumbling of a distant storm. It was almost like it had a mind of its own, a consciousness that was slowly waking up. Leon, stop, Sarah's voice cut through his thoughts, and he blinked, coming back to the present. He was standing in the middle of the lab, a hand outstretched, his fingers twitching as if he were pulling the very air around him. The desk in front of him was buckling, folding inward, as though gravity itself was compressing it into nothingness. His heart raced as he fought to regain control. His breath came in shallow gasps. The black hole inside him wasn't just manipulating objects anymore. It was manipulating him. The more he used it, the more he felt like he was losing himself. Leon. Sarah called again, more urgently this time. She had her hands on his shoulders now, pulling him back. You have to stop. You can't control it this way. Leon gasped, the words coming out ragged. I need to fix it. The planet, it's dying. It's all falling apart. I have to, I know. But you're not going to fix anything if you destroy yourself in the process. She shook him slightly, trying to focus his attention. Think about it. Every time you bend gravity, every time you push further into that, whatever it is inside you, you're not just changing the world. You're changing yourself. What if it starts pulling you apart? What if, I know, Leon muttered, finally able to tear his focus away from the destructive pull he was creating. I can feel it. But I can't stop, Sarah. I have to try. If I don't, the world. You need to stabilize it. This is bigger than any one person, she interrupted, her voice steady despite the obvious fear in her eyes. We need to understand how this works before it gets out of hand. Leon's mind raced. He had to think. His every instinct screamed at him to continue, to push forward. Earth was on the brink of collapse, rising oceans, deteriorating ecosystems, and a desperate need for a solution. He had to fix it. But Sarah was right. If he didn't control it, it wouldn't be the world he saved. It would be the world he destroyed. What do you want me to do? Leon asked, his voice shaky but determined. He was breathing more easily now, but it wasn't over. The black hole inside him was still there, still stirring like a monster just beneath the surface, waiting for its chance to rise. We need a containment system, Sarah said, pulling him over to the makeshift workbench where they'd been trying to design a way to stabilize the gravitational force inside him. You can't just keep pushing it outward. The more you use it, the more unstable it becomes. But we might be able to create something that can act as a buffer. It'll dampen the effects. Maybe even allow you to focus your energy. Leon nodded, trying to focus. He didn't have much time. The whole planet didn't have much time. All right. Let's do it. They worked in silence for hours, the hum of the machines around them mixing with the crackling tension in the air. Leon could feel the black hole inside him every moment, its hunger growing, its power expanding. But for once, he forced himself to ignore it. Sarah had always been the grounded one between them, and now, she was his anchor. They had to design a device that could regulate his gravitational field, dampening its intensity so that he could control it, use it without collapsing in on himself. But as they worked, Leon realized something he hadn't before. The more they tinkered with the equipment, the more they adjusted the parameters, the more they began to sense a pattern in the way the black hole was behaving. It wasn't random. It was intelligent. I think it's trying to talk to us, Leon said, his voice quiet. Sarah turned to him, confused. What do you mean? It's a black hole, Leon. It's a force of nature, he paused, running a hand through his hair. It's responding to me, but it's doing it in a way that feels deliberate. Almost like, it's aware of what I'm doing. It's not just some force of nature anymore. It's alive. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Sarah broke the silence. What are you going to do about it? Leon's gaze hardened. I'm not going to let it consume me. Not again. They worked in silence for several more hours, trying to design a containment system that would prevent the black hole from destabilizing him entirely. But with every adjustment, the machine began to hum louder. The walls of the lab seemed to tremble, as though the space itself were fighting back against the device they were trying to build. Finally, Leon stood up, backing away from the workbench. We need to accelerate the process. I can't keep this thing contained much longer. Sarah looked at him, her face pale. Leon, but before she could say anything more, the ground trembled beneath their feet. The hum from the black hole surged, rising to a deafening crescendo. The lights overhead flickered violently, casting the lab in intermittent darkness. Hold on! Leon shouted, grabbing Sarah's arm as the floor tilted beneath them. The walls of the lab began to warp, bending inward, the very fabric of reality distorting around them. It was the black hole. It was reacting, and not in a way they had anticipated. Get out of the way. Leon shouted, pushing Sarah toward the door as the walls buckled inward, collapsing in on themselves. He could feel the power surging through him now, the black hole inside him pulsing like a heartbeat. He had to regain control. He had to fix this. In an instant, the door burst open, and the entire lab was sucked into the gravity well of his body. The floor, the walls, the equipment, all of it was drawn toward him as though the universe itself had decided to collapse into the singularity within him. He reached out, his mind racing, and with an immense effort of will, he forced the pull to stop. Slowly, inch by inch, he felt the energy retreating. The room stopped distorting, and the debris fell back to the ground with a thud. The silence was deafening. Sarah was standing a few feet away, staring at him, her face a mixture of awe and terror. "You did it," she whispered, voice shaky. You actually stopped it." Leon's body trembled with exhaustion. He had done it. But only for now. The black hole inside him was still there, still pulsing with an insatiable hunger. And as the world outside the lab continued its decline, Leon realized something he hadn't truly understood before. He wasn't just carrying the weight of his own survival. He was carrying the weight of the planet's future. And if he couldn't master the force inside him, the Earth might not survive. "We need to move," Leon said, his voice tight. "I can't stay here. We need to find a way to fix this. Permanently." The next few weeks were a blur of experiments, both in the lab and in Leon's mind. He tried everything he could think of to contain the black hole inside him, but it was growing more powerful with every attempt. The world outside was crumbling faster than he could work: climate disasters, wars over resources, entire cities falling into chaos. In the end, it wasn't a solution that saved them. It was a choice. Leon had to make a sacrifice. The black hole inside him was too dangerous to control, too hungry for power. He had to release it, let it dissipate into the void where it belonged. It meant the end of his abilities, the end of his power, but it was the only way to restore balance. As he stood at the edge of the world, gazing out over the cities that would now begin to rebuild, he understood the cost of his actions. The black hole was gone, but so was his chance to change the world with his power. And yet, in that moment, as the sun dipped below the horizon, he knew something else: he had saved the Earth. Not because of his abilities, but because he had learned that even the greatest power must eventually be tempered by wisdom and sacrifice. The world would move on. And so would he.